Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of political media to see exactly how a nightly broadcast is actually constructed from the ground up. Our goal here is to just objectively map out the, frankly, highly varied and intense arguments presented in the April 29th broadcast of the Ingraham angle. We're going to unpack how this specific show structures its narrative, and we'll use some clear visuals to help us see how the host moves the audience from immediate, localized domestic security threats all the way to complex international trade, literally in the span of a single evening. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap. We'll start with a breakdown of a presidential assassination attempt, pivot to a proposed Iran blockade, examine a major Supreme Court voting rights ruling, look at a journalist's assault case, and finally, dive into the debate over Chinese auto imports. Let's start with segment 1. Section 1. The Trump assassination attempt, focusing on security timelines and unanswered questions. The broadcast focused heavily on a recent security breach at the Washington Hilton involving a man named Cole Thomas Allen. They laid out a minute-by-minute timeline to critique the venue's vulnerability, and this brilliantly illustrates how they mapped it out. At 8:03 p.m., Allen reportedly took a mirror selfie in his hotel room, armed with a shotgun, knives, and wire cutters. At 8:15 p.m., right as VIPs, including the president and vice president, arrived, Allen left his room. Finally, at 8:27 p.m., after allegedly watching a video of the president on his phone, he rushed the security checkpoint, the magnetometers on the lower level. The broadcast pointed out that because the hotel was active, the Secret Service just didn't have full operational control of the upper floors. This basically allowed an armed individual to roam freely before hitting that primary protective bubble. Now, despite mapping out that timeline, the broadcast highlighted a few really lingering, unanswered questions. The biggest one raised by the host was, who actually shot the Secret Service agent? Was it Cole Allen or was it friendly fire during the chaotic takedown? While the host expressed deep concern over these unknowns, guest Representative Byron Donalds offered a slightly different perspective. He stated his high confidence in Secret Service Director Sean Curran, emphasizing that, hey, despite the unanswered questions, the agents did their job admirably by neutralizing the threat quickly at the magnetometers before the ballroom was breached. But notice how the broadcast uses these lingering unknowns to keep viewers right on the edge of their seats regarding their own domestic safety. Moving right along to Section 2, the Iran blockade and foreign policy, looking at the argument from maximum pressure. Transitioning sharply from domestic security to the Middle East, the show framed a proposed blockade against Iran purely as a matter of raw naval power. To drive this point home, they featured Tom Sauer, a former Navy explosive ordnance disposal officer. He argued, let Iran have a nuclear weapon. We've knocked out their Navy, we've knocked out their anti-aircraft, now they have to cry uncle. So Sauer's perspective, which was platformed by the broadcast, asserts that by utilizing the U.S. Navy to enforce a strict blockade and deny billions in revenue, Iran's economy would essentially collapse, effectively forcing them into surrender, all without putting American boots on the ground. So the crucial point is how the broadcast neutrally juxtaposed two very different trade-offs here. On one hand, critics argue this strategy would cause a short-term spike in your local gas prices and seriously strain the domestic economy. But on the other hand, a nuclear-armed Iran controlling the Strait of Hormuz. The broadcast framed this choice between temporary pain at the pump and potential global catastrophe as an absolute no-brainer. In their framing, the financial sacrifice was more than justified when weighed against those massive international security risks. All right, Section 3, the SCOTUS voting rights ruling and redrawing the congressional map. Analyzing a recent Supreme Court ruling regarding congressional redistricting in Louisiana, the show framed this as a monumental shift in how race is legally permitted to be used when drawing political maps. The whole debate centered entirely around Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. As defined by the show's legal guests, including attorney David Schoen, the Supreme Court's ruling interpreted Section 2 as now requiring proof of intentional discrimination to strike down a map. That is a massive shift from simply relying on proportional racial outcomes. The host argued that previous interpretations forced the creation of geographically illogical, amoeba-like snake districts, and that this practice is now effectively over. But what are the actual political stakes here? Well, pollster Matt Towery projected that because Republicans have controlled the redistricting process in several states, this specific Supreme Court constraint being lifted could lead to a massive gain of 10 to 19 House seats for the Republican Party. So the broadcast presented this not just as some dry legal victory, but as a phenomenal shift in momentum that could directly decide the control of Congress. Up next, Section 4, the Savannah Hernandez assault case, focusing on federal charges and media protections. Here, the broadcast used a physical assault against a journalist to emphasize what they see as the absolute necessity of federal intervention when local authorities allegedly failed to protect citizens. The incident took place at an anti-ICE protest in Minneapolis, where frontline reporter Savannah Hernandez claimed she was violently attacked simply for observing the event. The show reported that after local officials in Hennepin County initially failed to bring sufficient charges, despite clear video evidence, federal indictments against 3 members of the Strutzko family were finally handed down. The host used this localized incident to make a broader argument that federal entities, like the FBI and DOJ, must step in to stop what they described as coordinated political violence against the media. Finally, Section 5, Chinese automakers in the U.S., covering technology, trade, and tariffs. In our final segment, the show explored the fierce debate over Ford allegedly holding talks with Chinese automaker Geely. They framed this as an existential threat to the American working class and to national security. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how they used an industry leader's own words to validate their anti-import stance. They highlighted a warning from Ford CEO Jim Farley. They have enough capacity in China to cover all the vehicle sales in the United States. We should not let them into our country. The show argued that any free trade agreements allowing cheap Chinese cars into the U.S. would totally gut American manufacturing and cost countless jobs. To counter this perceived threat, the show featured Ohio Senator Bernie Moreno, who wants to literally hermetically seal the U.S. auto market from Chinese imports entirely. But his second reason is where things get really intense. He argued this blockade is necessary to stop the creation of what he called roving surveillance devices. Moreno posited that Chinese manufactured vehicles are laden with technology designed to actively spy on Americans, basically framing the cars sitting in your driveway as literal intelligence-gathering tools operating on American soil. Building directly on that surveillance theme, Moreno pointed to a U.S. federal mandate that requires new cars by 2027 to feature a driver impairment kill switch. He claimed on the broadcast that this specific technology currently has an astonishing 80% failure rate, meaning your own car might falsely accuse you of drunk driving and just shut itself down. The show expertly tied this isolated statistic back to their broader nightly theme, the idea that everyday Americans are under constant threat from both invasive foreign tech and absurd domestic government policies. And that brings us to the end. I mean, think about it. We've gone from a hotel security breach to naval blockades in the Middle East, from the Supreme Court to a street protest, and finally to spy cars in the auto industry. It begs the ultimate question. How does political media synthesize these entirely isolated events into one cohesive nightly worldview? By examining the framing we just walked through, you can see exactly how specific narratives are constructed, connected, and delivered to shape the audience's reality. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep analyzing the media you consume, stay curious, and I'll see you next time.